Story 1. This incident took place about 10 years ago. I grew up in a modest-sized house. For most of my childhood, I shared a room with my older brother. We had two twin beds on opposite sides, two dressers, and two closets. There wasn't even enough space for a desk. It wasn't overly crowded, but it certainly wasn't spacious either. When my brother left for college, I immediately moved his bed out of the room and essentially took over the extra space, with his full permission, of course. I was finally at an age where having a desk in my bedroom was essential, so it was nice not needing to do my homework in the basement or upstairs in my dad's office. This setup worked perfectly for the 2 years before I went off to college myself, at which point I wasn't living at home anymore, so it didn't really matter. After graduating, my brother found a job in our hometown area, so he ended up moving back into our parents' house. And the very first thing he did, you guessed it, was reclaim our shared bedroom that I had spent months diligently redesigning. I was a bit annoyed at first, but my parents put it in perspective by reminding me that I had basically done the same thing to him, so it was only fair. I couldn't argue with that, so I just accepted it. By the time I graduated, I had also secured a job in the city, so I decided to move back into my parents' house, just like my brother had done. Unfortunately, I no longer had a room, so I had to figure out a different arrangement. The only other unused space in the house was our upstairs guest bedroom. Even though it was half the size of my old room, it would have to do. The guest room was right next to my dad's office, which was the only other room on that floor. It was also situated directly above the garage, meaning every time someone pressed the garage door opener, the entire floor would vibrate for the full 10 seconds it took for the door to go up. The room actually slightly extends beyond the main house, since it's on a corner, so there were two windows on connecting walls, one looking out onto the driveway, and the other overlooking one side of the house. It wasn't ideal, but it was private and usually quiet. This particular event occurred on a Friday evening, when I was alone at home. My brother was in Baltimore for a work-related conference, and my parents were spending the night at our family's shore house, as they typically did most summer weekends. I was coming off an incredibly exhausting day at work, so I decided not to go out with any friends or even leave the house. I simply wanted to order some food and call it an early night. It was around 11:30 p.m., and I was in bed reading a book, trying to unwind from the day. The house was completely silent, which was quite pleasant, since it's usually pretty chaotic when everyone's home. That's when I distinctly heard the garage door beginning to open, followed by that very familiar floor vibration that I had grown accustomed to over the past few months. It took a few seconds for the gravity of the situation to fully register. None of my family members should have been home. My parents had specifically said they were staying at the shore house until Sunday night, and my brother wasn't due back until Saturday afternoon. It took several more seconds for that realization to completely sink in, but when it did, my heart began to pound. I immediately sprang out of bed and peered out the window towards the driveway, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I could tell the garage door was open, but I couldn't make out if there was a car inside or who might have opened it. Without a second thought, I rummaged through the closet until I found one of the baseball bats my parents had stored there from my younger days. As I quietly descended the stairs, I tried to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation for the garage door open. Maybe my parents had forgotten something and driven back. Perhaps my brother's plans had changed. Heck, maybe the door had just malfunctioned and opened by itself. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, just before turning the corner towards the main living area, I could hear faint voices. The voices were definitely coming from the opposite side of the house, where all the bedrooms were located. They were too soft for me to understand what they were saying, but I could tell that at least two people were talking. That's when I knew for certain that someone had broken into our house. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address and telling the operator that my house was currently being burglarized. I left the call active and put the phone back in my pocket, just as they advised. The operator instructed me to stay put and not reveal my presence, but I felt an overwhelming urge to defend my home. It was as if some unseen force was compelling me to act, rather than just hide and wait. So disregarding the operator's instructions, I decided that's exactly what I was going to do. I crept down the hallway towards the voices, clutching the baseball bat as tightly as I could. As I got closer to my parents' bedroom, I could hear the sounds of drawers being opened and items being moved around. They were clearly searching for valuables. I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to do was probably foolish, but I couldn't stop myself. I began yelling as loudly as possible to catch them off guard, then charged into the room with the baseball bat raised above my head. There were two men rummaging through my mother's closet, and they both cried out in surprise when I burst through the door. I could tell they hadn't expected anyone to be home, let alone someone willing to fight back. That gave me a surge of confidence, despite being outnumbered and the possibility that they might have their own weapons. I swung the bat at the closer of the two men, hitting his leg. He cursed and limped a few steps before falling. I turned to the other one, but before I could get a clean swing at him, he lowered his shoulder and tackled me. Before I could react, we both hit the ground hard, and I immediately realized this guy was much larger and stronger than me. He easily wrestled the bat out of my hands. Then he got his hands around my throat and started choking me. I was fighting for my life, clawing at his hands, and trying to get him off me when I saw the first guy crawling towards us. He had something in his hand that looked like a knife. In that moment, I realized I had made a grave mistake by trying to be a hero, a mistake that was going to cost me my life. I genuinely thought those might be my final moments. I started to accept that I was going to die in my parents' bedroom, and all I could think about was how devastated my mom would be when she found out. But then, faintly in the background, I heard the sound of police sirens approaching. The last thing I remember is the second guy picking up my baseball bat and swinging it at my head. Everything went black after that. When I woke up, someone was gently shaking me. I opened my eyes to see a police officer kneeling beside me, asking if I was okay. I was dazed and confused, and it took me several seconds to recall what had happened. I looked around the room and saw that the door connecting my parents' bedroom to the backyard was wide open. The intruders had clearly knocked me out and escaped through the back when they heard the siren. The officer told me to stay put and not to move too much in case I had a concussion or other injuries. I had a terrible headache, but I was conscious and able to think clearly, which seemed like a good sign. Once the paramedics confirmed I was okay, I refused to go to the hospital despite their recommendations. I gave the officers a detailed account of everything that had happened. They told me they were currently searching the neighborhood for suspects, but by the time they arrived, the men were long gone. After the police finished their investigation and took some photos of the scene, I called my parents and brother to inform them about what had happened. My parents harshly scolded me for being foolish enough to confront those guys, and I deserved it. Had I simply done the smart thing and hidden, there's a good chance the police might have been able to catch the perpetrator. The men were never found, even after the police thoroughly searched the neighborhood and followed up on a few leads. My parents installed a comprehensive security system the moment they returned from the shore house, complete with cameras, motion sensors, lights, the whole 9 yards. In the days following the break-in, something about the whole situation kept bothering me. All the doors to my house were locked that night, and the only way to open the garage door was through a small button in my car that my dad had programmed to be a wireless switch. There was no way anyone would just stumble upon it. Whoever had broken in that night must have known me or my family well enough to know where that button was. Up until that moment, I never locked my car when it was in the driveway either, so that's something the culprits would have had to know as well. Even more concerning was the timing. They somehow knew that my parents would be away for the weekend, and that my brother was out of town. I don't live in that house anymore, but my parents were never able to figure out who had broken in. It was actually something that made my dad very paranoid for a long time, as he also believed that whoever had broken in was connected to our family in some way. I'm not going to go as far as to say that night changed me forever or anything cliché like that, but I will say one thing. Life before and after you've accepted you're going to die are two very different things. I can still remember that feeling of thinking it was the end for me. It just felt so disorienting. Nothing can truly replicate that feeling. Story 2. This happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still unsettled by how deliberate and personal the entire incident felt. I had recently moved back to my hometown to help care for my aging mother, who lives about 20 minutes away from me. I found a small duplex that was perfect for my situation, close enough to reach her quickly if needed, but far enough that I still had my own space and independence. My mom has been experiencing some health issues lately, Nothing life-threatening, but she's had a few minor falls around the house, and she's very stubborn about accepting help. I've been trying to convince her to get one of those medical alert systems, but she insists she doesn't need one, and that I'm just being overly protective. It's been a constant source of stress for me, especially knowing that she's alone most of the time. On this particular evening, I was just getting ready to settle in for the night. It was around 9 p.m., and I was on the couch watching TV when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number I didn't recognize, but since I was still relatively new to the area, I thought it might be important and answered. The woman on the other end identified herself as a nurse at a local emergency room. She stated that my mother had been admitted about an hour ago after taking a fall and hitting her head. According to her, my mom was conscious but was asking for me, and they wanted to know if I could get to the hospital quickly. I was horrified. This was exactly the kind of call I'd been dreading since moving back. I didn't question the legitimacy of the call for a second. The woman on the other end knew my mother's full name, her address, and even mentioned her recent hip replacement surgery from a few months ago. I immediately stopped what I was doing, trying to keep calm and compose myself by saying a silent prayer. I didn't even think about locking up the house. I just grabbed my keys, pulled the front door shut behind me, and rushed to my car. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare. I kept replaying scenarios in my head, and only a few of them were even remotely positive. When I got to the ER, I hurried to the reception desk and told them I was there for my mother. I gave them her name and explained I'd received a call about her fall. The nurse looked puzzled and checked her computer, then informed me there was no record of anyone by that name being admitted or treated that evening. I insisted there must be some mistake since I had just gotten a call from someone claiming to be a nurse there. The receptionist was sympathetic but firm. They had no record of my mother being brought in, and they suggested I try calling her directly to ensure she was okay. So that's what I did. I stepped outside and called my mom's landline, and she answered. She said she'd been sleeping and wanted to know why I was calling so late. I didn't want to alarm her, so I just said I was checking up on her and told her to go back to bed. And that's when the gut-wrenching realization hit me. This had been a trap. Someone had intentionally given me false information to lure me out of my house. I jumped back in my car, furious that I'd been so easily tricked. When I pulled into my driveway, the front door was still closed, just as I'd left it. For a moment I thought maybe I was being paranoid and nothing had happened. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew I'd been robbed. The house had been completely ransacked. My TV was gone, along with my laptop and a small jewelry collection I kept in my bedroom. But as I looked around more carefully, I realized the thieves had also taken some truly strange things. Family photos had been removed from their frames. Not the frames themselves, just the actual pictures. My prescription bottles from the bathroom medicine cabinet had been emptied and taken. It was insane. They had taken items that had relatively little monetary value, yet immense sentimental value to me. It was sadistic. I'm telling you, there's no logical reason a thief would ever take family photos. There just is. I called the police immediately, but I was already feeling defeated at that point. Deep down, I knew the thieves were long gone, and there was nothing I could do about it. I told the police everything. I remembered the phone call word for word, and after hearing it, the police reached the same conclusion I had. Whoever had been on the other end had known things about my mother and me that no stranger could possibly know. For the life of me, I couldn't even come up with a list of people who would have that information, or even ways that someone could have obtained that information in the first place. The officers told me to feel free to call back whenever I had something concrete. Then they left. I was utterly baffled. Just imagine how unsettled you'd feel if some stranger knew enough about you to trick you into leaving your house. The theft itself was bad enough, but the fact that they targeted family photos and medical information suggested it wasn't just about quick cash. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something longer term, possibly identity theft, or some other scheme that required personal documentation. But over the next few weeks, nothing else happened. Even though my mother can't remember who she might have talked to about her personal info, I'm pretty confident that she's the source of the leak. She surprisingly has a lot of friends for a woman her age, and knowing her, she probably said too much to the wrong person. I've cautioned my mother about that very thing, and she's finally agreed to be more careful about who she shares personal information with. But I can't shake the feeling that we're still being watched by someone who knows too much about our lives and isn't finished with whatever they're planning. Either way, I recently got a Ring camera, so hopefully that's enough of a deterrent. If anything else happens, I'll send an update. Story 3. I'm a single man in my early 30s, and I've been living alone in this rented house for over a year now. It's a nice little place in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it's comfortable, and the rent is fair. I've fallen into a good routine here, and truly feel like I've made it my home. The incident occurred on a Thursday night around. I was getting ready for bed when I heard aggressive pounding on my front door. Not just knocking, but actual hammering, like someone was trying to break it down. I looked out the window but couldn't see much because the porch light was poorly placed. Despite not being able to see who it was and the intensity of the knocking, I'm a pretty strong guy, so I wasn't scared or anything. More so annoyed and confused. I opened the front door, being careful to keep the screen door closed as an added layer of protection. I'm not sure what I expected to see, but what I did see was surprising, to say the least. There was an extremely agitated man standing there. He looked to be maybe a few years older than me. He was of average height, had messy hair, and was wearing clothes that looked like they'd been slept in for multiple nights straight. But what truly grabbed my attention was how angry and unstable he appeared. His eyes were darting around and he was breathing heavily, as if he'd been running or was having some kind of panic attack. He was also pacing constantly, unable to keep still. Before I could even ask what he wanted, he started yelling that this was his house and demanded that I let him. He claimed I was trespassing and that he was going to call the police if I didn't leave immediately. I thought he was either on drugs or experiencing some kind of mental health crisis, or perhaps a combination of both. I tried to calm him down and explained that he had the wrong house, but he became even more agitated. That's when he started rattling off details about the house that made me freak. I don't even remember everything he said, but he knew several things about the house that you couldn't possibly observe from outside it. Details that only someone who had genuinely lived there would know. Like, for instance, he knew that the master bedroom door is poorly designed and bumps into the toilet. He knew that the back door sticks and you have to lift it slightly while turning the doorknob. There were other things too, but I honestly can't recall them all. I don't think I even said anything while he was talking. I was just standing there in shock. But that was only the beginning. It was about to get much, much stranger. Through the screen door he pulled out a folder and started showing me documentation. He had what seemed to be a lease agreement with his name on it, dated from about 6 months before I'd moved in. He had pieces of mail addressed to him at this address. Everything looked official, though I suspected it had been somehow forged. But the most unsettling part was when he pulled out his phone and started showing me photos. They were actual pictures of him inside my house, sitting on my current couch watching TV, cooking in the kitchen, even lying down in what was now my bedroom. The photos looked recent and entirely legitimate. They weren't obviously photoshopped or staged, and most of them weren't solo. They included other people, all of whom I'd never seen before. He showed me one photo he claimed was from this past 4th of July, just a few months ago. It was a selfie taken by a woman I didn't recognize. In it, the woman, him, and a few other people were facing the camera and smiling at the kitchen table. There was a box of fireworks off to the side, and the detail and context of the picture made it look completely authentic. That's when I genuinely started questioning my own memory and sanity. How could this person have all this evidence if they never lived here? I started wondering if I had somehow blocked out memories of sharing the house with someone, and if I was the one having some kind of psychological breakdown. It was freaky, especially since I knew for a fact that I had been home on the 4th of July. So the pictures made even less sense. The whole situation was so surreal that I told him I was going to call the police to sort everything out. Not even in an antagonistic way. I just didn't know what else to do. I figured they could check the records and determine what was going on. But the moment I mentioned calling the police, the guy's demeanor changed completely. He suddenly became very calm and said he'd wait outside while I made the call. Then he just walked away from the door and disappeared into the darkness. I watched from the window, but I couldn't see where he went. When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, I explained the whole bizarre situation. They told me I should try reaching out to my landlord to get in contact with the previous tenants, and that I might get some answers that way. I had all the necessary documentation proving I was renting this house, but when I offered to show it to them, they waved it off. They said whoever had been on my doorstep was probably just going through a mental episode, and as long as they were gone, I should just carry on with my life. Then they left. I wasn't just going to sit there and be satisfied with that. Whether or not that guy had left still left the question of how in the world he had all that evidence. With my landlord's help, I was eventually able to get in contact with the previous tenant. I should mention that my landlord had no idea what had happened either, and said he didn't know anyone matching that guy's description and had never rented to anyone like that. But anyway, the old tenants also had no idea who I was talking about.
They said they'd never lived with anyone matching his description, and they lived in the house alone for 3 years before moving out. They were just as confused as I was about how this stranger could have such detailed knowledge of the house and apparently legitimate photos of himself inside of it. For the next 2 weeks, I was constantly on edge, but nothing happened, and I started to think that maybe it had just been some elaborate scam that had failed. But of course, that turned out to be mostly wishful thinking. One night, I came home from a night out with my friends to find my house completely ransacked. It wasn't like a typical burglary where someone grabs obvious valuables and runs. The place was entirely turned upside down, as if someone had been looking for something specific. What that thing was, I had no idea. The craziest part is that most of my electronics and other valuable items were still there, despite the fact that the rooms they were in were completely trashed. The police found no signs of forced entry, which suggested that whoever did it had a copy of my key. Given the timing and connection to the strange incident 2 weeks earlier, it seemed obvious that the same person was responsible. The police took things more seriously after that, and so did my landlord. He immediately replaced all the locks in the house free of charge, and also installed additional security measures. The prevailing theory, and the one I believe, is that some mentally unwell person truly believes he lives in my house and broke in to look for his personal belongings or something. And okay, sure, that's problematic enough on its own, but that does absolutely nothing to explain how he had all that documentation, let alone actual copies of my house key. I wish I had been sensible enough to take a closer look at that so-called lease agreement he had shown me, because I might have been able to get his name. But in the moment, I just wasn't thinking clearly. The documents don't even bother me that much. All that stuff could have been easily forged or altered, including the alleged pieces of mail. What truly unnerves me to my core, though, are the pictures. I have no explanation for any of that stuff. It's possible they're really old pictures whose dates are but even if that's the case, it still doesn't explain how my landlord, who's owned that house his entire life, didn't recognize him. One of my friends suggested that I'm up against something not fully natural. I don't believe in that kind of stuff, but I will say that I've had this constant creepy feeling hanging over me whenever I'm in my own home, which is most of the time. I can't even begin to rationalize the whole thing. I just hope that's the end of it.